Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Congressman Israel, we are live and we can get started.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Our program tonight, Education Politics, setting the stage for the 2021 elections, 2022 elections, and a legislative briefing from someone who is better equipped to do that than anyone I know, the chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. Rosa DeLauro and I had a bitter and partisan debate when we served together in the Congress. Congresswoman Chairwoman DeLauro insisting that Connecticut pizza was better than Long Island pizza. It got very ugly, but we will not go into that this evening. The mission of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, for those of you who are new, is to deepen discourse and raise understanding. Our guests have included former President Bill Clinton just several weeks ago, the former Chief of Staff to President Trump, Reince Priebus, Speaker Pelosi, and many others. Before we begin, just some brief housekeeping. May 19th at 7, we'll be presenting a program on navigating international hostage situations. This should be a fascinating event. And this is with the former governor and UN Ambassador Bill Richardson. Governor and Ambassador Richardson has been proficient and very deeply involved in negotiating global hostage situations. And he'll be talking to us about what he has been doing and how to properly address those crises. Again, that's May 19th at 7. As always, to register for that or other programs, just Google Cornell Institute of Politics, go to our site and register. Tonight, we do have some distinguished guests. General H.R. McMaster is tuning in. General McMaster is with Hoover in New York City, in California. He obviously served as a national security advisor and served this nation well as a general. Education staffers from various U.S. congressional and Senate offices. Former Congressman John Barrow is with us. Former Congressman Martin Frost is with us. A member of the New York State Assembly, Steve Stern, is with us. New York State Regent Roger Tillis, the controller of Nassau County in New York, Jack Schneerman, two members of the Nassau County and Suffolk County legislatures, Kara Hahn, Suffolk County legislator, and Josh Laffison, Nassau County legislator. Tonight, conversation between our panelists, Chairwoman DeLauro, and then at 7:45, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. Natalie will instruct you on how to ask a question. And then at 8, a very special message from an international expert on education who we will properly introduce later in the program. We have reactions from a distinguished roster of Cornellians. Dan Leeds, the co-founder of Education Champions, and Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. I'll properly introduce them. And of course, Dr. Anna Greenberg. I'm going to introduce Dr. Greenberg, who's going to introduce Chairwoman DeLauro, and we'll begin the conversation. Dr. Anna Greenberg has over 20 years of experience polling in the political, nonprofit, and academic sectors since joining GQR in 2001 after teaching public opinion and survey research methodology at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Not bad, compared to Cornell, not bad. She was the lead pollster in many successful campaigns at all levels of government. In 2014, she won Pollster of the Year award for her work with Mayor Bill de Blasio's campaign for mayor of New York City. She served on the board of the American National Election Study from 2014 to 2017. And I'm very proud of the fact that she is on the board of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research at Cornell. We are very pleased by her presence tonight. She is also another illustrious alum of Cornell University. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Give us a sense of the challenges and opportunities for advancing education as an issue in this political cycle, given the current political climate. And then you're going to introduce Chairwoman DeLauro.
I will. So first of all, thank you, Congressman Israel. It's a pleasure to be here. It is just very cool to be reconnected with Cornell after, can you believe it, Rosa, 35 years since I graduated from college. And I saw in the chat there was another proud resident of U-Haul 4 on this on today's conversation. So that's very cool. And so let me just say a couple things. I think that our entire political conversation about education was really upended by COVID. Going into the 2020 election, that election could have been about many, many things, but ultimately it was a referendum on how Trump handled COVID and the subsequent economic fallout of the pandemic. And it really crowded out any other kind of conversation that you might have had, including about education. Except that, what happened during COVID was it really revealed all of the challenges that we face around education. To have, and I say this of the mother of 3 children who are all doing 100% online school for the last 14 months. They're wandering around the house right now somewhere. For families to have to deal with not just kids, with school shutting down and having various, whether it's 100% online or hybrid or some in person, but also daycare centers and childcare, to have that kind of disruption in people's lives that, nobody could ever imagine something like that happening, really revealed in some ways the way we rely on the education system to honestly take care of our children, right? And at the same time, if you think about college and higher ed, you had all of the challenges of the kids who were going to college, were in college, and what happened, whether it was people sort of delaying a year or doing college remotely. And even more important in some ways, for the people who saw their wages drop, which was substantially across the board, or lost their jobs, going to community college or going to college or higher ed became unaffordable and out of reach. And so COVID really kind of exposed in a lot of ways the inequality in our education system, because certainly you had families, at least if you think K through 12, who could afford to hire people to help them teach their children, or could join with their pods, and you have other kids who, even with an air card from the school and a laptop, really couldn't, didn't have a room to study in, that didn't have multiple people in it. And so you just saw how the level of inequality in our education system was so exposed by COVID. And so coming out of COVID, we're not out yet. My kids aren't vaccinated yet. We're not out yet. But, I think it presents both challenges, and, opportunities. So, one, I think, really big opportunity is that one of the things that the 2 things that parents are really concerned about, if we're talking about K through 12, is socialization, huge issue, not seeing your friends, not participating in sports, not doing kind of the life cycle events like going to the prom, and the ways that, at various stages of social and emotional development that affected, kids differently at different stages. And so a real, strong desire to kind of get back to normal in that respect, but also real concerns about education gaps. There's going to be a huge range for some kids who probably didn't fall behind at all, or or it just, what it will take to catch up is relatively minor. And you're going to have kids who profoundly fell behind. And one of the things that I've seen in my research among parents, and I'm sure that Randy's seen this too in her parent surveys, is really strong support for investing in helping close those education gaps, including, and not just with parents, but with students also. It's a polling I've done with students, which is investing in tutoring, social services, mental health. And by the way, mental health, not just for kids, but for teachers. And there's wide recognition that teachers also suffered mightily dealing with not just their own families with COVID, but then trying to figure out how to teach in an entirely new way. And, and with no model, with every school system having a different approach, with having lots of people who had different levels, and to this day, different levels of tolerance for being in person or not. There is, in that vein, very strong support for the relief package passed by Congress and signed by Biden, and in particular, the pieces of the package that deal with helping K through 12. So whether it's money for schools to help figure out how to kind of catch up and build an infrastructure around tutoring and other kinds of interventions to get kids back to where they were, but also, investment in community colleges and historic Black universities. Every poll you see, there's, upwards of 55, 65, 70% support for all of the money that's in that package to try to get us back to some place, though we all know that place we were wasn't necessarily great. And that's the part that I think is kind of a challenge, which is to say, I think that our conversation around education is we have like support for individual policies, but it, in part because education is controlled locally and at the state level and not so much at the federal level, we tend not to have the national conversation that we need to have about how schools, the resources that schools need, and not just in K through 12, but also in higher ed. And I'll just point out two ways that there's a challenge, and then I'll stop and I'll introduce Rosa. The first one is people have very different views about education policy and spending depending on where they are in their life cycle. So if you have a child under the age of 18, you have a very specific set of concerns, whether it's, what's going on in school itself, or whether or not your kid is going to go to college or not, and how, if they are, how they're going to afford it and what their opportunities are going to be. If you are 65, 70 years old and you're, you're 20, 30, 40 years away from having young kids, and frankly, I say this with love to all the grandparents out there, I haven't done a focus group where seniors want to pay property taxes to pay for their local schools. And so it's a much, even if people have grandchildren, funding schools and interventions in schools is a much lower priority for older voters who are, mostly primarily concerned with Social Security, preserving Social Security and Medicare and the cost of prescription drugs. And so you have a very large constituency in our electorate who simply just don't care as much, frankly, about spending on K through 12 or higher ed, because they are beyond it, their children are beyond it, and maybe their grandchildren are sort of in it, but they kind of view that as their, as those kids' parents' responsibility to sort out. And I think that was a challenge before COVID, and I think it will continue to be a challenge. And I think what you will see is, I know this is a nonpartisan institute, but I think you will see Republicans going after some of the money that's been allocated to schools. And we already see some of that, frankly, particularly because some states didn't actually lose all that much revenue. And so people want to know why all this money is going there. And so you're going to see some real challenges around that. And I think for seniors in particular, since it's not very much of a priority for them, it may resonate with them. The other challenge, I think, is higher ed. That's, you could do an entire section just in higher ed, but we're talking about politics and policy. I think the conversation that happened during the presidential primary in the Democratic primary wasn't that helpful. I think that, the perception was that Democrats are just for free college. Not only does that feel sort of elite because, 65 to 68% of people in this country do not go to a 4-year degree granting institution. And even though college can mean many things besides a 4-year degree, that is the perception when people talk about college. That's what you're talking about. And so it feels like something that's for other people and not for them. And the same thing is true of talking about student loan debt. As we know, student loan debt is a crushing financial burden on young people and even older people who spend a lot of their adult life trying to pay it off. It makes it hard to buy a house. It makes it hard to have kids. It inhibits economic growth, broadly speaking. But there's less support for eliminating student debt than you might think. There's a lot of support for being able to refinance, to be able to have payments be contingent on your income level, all of which is, the lenders make very hard for you to do. But if you've had $100,000 of debt and you paid it off yesterday, and then the next day it gets wiped out for other people, that feels very unfair to people, right? And so there is even though there's support for dealing with debt, the notion of just blanket elimination of debt for everybody feels very, very unfair, kind of in the same way that when you talk to people who make just above minimum wage, get a little upset at the idea if they make $16 an hour and someone's going to have, who works at McDonald's, and most people think minimum wage jobs are people at McDonald's. We all know that's not true. It's a much broader swath of the workforce. They feel like it's unfair that they get their income doubled, their salary doubled. And what do they do to earn that besides just make the minimum wage? Whereas I make 16 an hour and I've worked my butt off to get to 16. And the same thing is true of student debt. And I think that the added layer around higher ed that's complicated is, I think fewer people went because of and applied because of COVID. And we're still got big economic challenges, even if the economy, booms, which it probably will. I'm not an economist, but we still have real economic challenges. People afford it. And we now have a narrative on the right around the value of college. And the number of Republicans, young Republicans, who are less likely to say that they will go to college or that they think college has value, that has become problematic on the right. And so while I think we, again, have a huge opportunity to really invest, especially in K through 12, in places that we might not have been able to do it before, because everybody understands that some kids are going to really need to catch up through no fault of their own. And people have seen the inequality. By the same token, I think there's the possibility of some backlash, especially if we pass infrastructure and the family support legislation. There'll be some backlash around spending, But I also think the whole college and higher ed conversation has gotten much more complicated. I don't know how it's all going to play out in 21 and 22. I don't have a crystal ball. But no question that these kinds of issues are really going to be at the forefront. So with that, I'll stop and take this opportunity to introduce Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. Rosa has been in Congress for 31 years, representing New Haven, Connecticut. She is a dynamo. Most recently, she has been elected to chair the Appropriations Committee, which is amazing. And as part of that, she has been a lifelong champion of investing in children and in education. And she, as you know, is a champion of the child tax credit. She first introduced child tax credit legislation in 2003. And in the most recent relief plan was able to not just get the child tax credit in there, but it's very generous. It's a really big deal. And I know she's fighting to make it permanent. Rosa is also the best grandmother in the entire world. She was my stepmother and the bubby to my children. And so it is my pleasure to pass the torch over to Rosa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What great warmth. And thank you, Anna, very, very much. And good evening to everyone. It's such a thank you, Anna, for your analysis. And you give us a lot to think about as we kick off the discussion. But just let me take a moment to what is the Yiddish expression, to kvel, and listening to Anna Greenberg. Yes, my stepdaughter, but Anna Greenberg is extraordinarily accomplished, and she is respected by leaders, people who value her unique skills and her insights. It's in her DNA. She knows how to win. She understands the electorate. And I can just say I'm just so enormously proud of all of her accomplishments and her successes. And her children are her great successes as well. And just had the pleasure of entertaining them over the last evening or in the evening before, which
Did you find Satan's soccer ball?
The big issue is I know now where Sadie's soccer ball is. It's a house around the corner, and we will get it for her. But I'll tell you this tonight, if I can't get it, I will buy her another soccer ball. So there we go. Anyway, Steve-O, thank you so much for the invitation tonight. For 16 years, we served in the Congress, in the trenches on issues, healthcare, education. I schlepped to Long Island, but we did a wonderful, wonderful event there on increasing the funding for cancer research, et cetera. And I know he has a big interest in this. And yes, New Haven, Connecticut, which has the very, very best pizza in the country. And we will just leave it at that.
I surrender. I surrender.
Surrender. Good. Hear, 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 hear. Listen, when Steve's words when he left the Capitol, and I quote, "Unindicted and undefeated to pursue a career as a writer, where he has done an outstanding job as head of the nonpartisan Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, where he is raising the discourse and providing for a deeper understanding of political issues and of geopolitics as well." I see Randy Weingarten there, and since 2008, she has served as president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO, known as a reform-minded leader. She has fought to make sure teachers and school support personnel are treated with respect and with dignity, that they have a voice in the education of their students, are given the support and resources they need to succeed. A great advocate for high quality public education, healthcare, and public services for kids, for families, for communities. What a wonderful partner Randy has been in ensuring that federal tax dollars are working for people. And I was honored, and I will just say this, to have her support in my race for chair of the House Appropriations Committee. And I always look forward to being a co-conspirator with Randy as we fight for families. And I would just say this, she has been instrumental in getting students back into this country's classrooms. And we thank you for that. And I wanted to say a thank you to you, Dan, another Cornellian here. My God, we're over the top with the Cornell graduates, co-founder of the Education Champions, Dan, and thank you for elevating the importance of education in our public discourse today. I know, Steve, you said you were going to recognize a guest later on, so I will wait for you to make that introduction. And but welcome your guest. Look, we all know how education can serve as a great equalizer. Opens doors, opens opportunities for jobs, higher wages, a better life. But we know it can only serve as that great equalizer if and only if it is affordable, accessible, and if it's achievable for all. And I believe that the government's role is to provide the opportunities for people to work for that common good. And the federal government has a central role to play in this effort. I'm honored to serve as chair of the House Appropriations Committee, one of the greatest honors of my life. And I also chair the subcommittee on labor, education, health, and human resources. And I believe that we must use this moment, as Anna talked about COVID, and we can't go back. You know, there's no going back to normal. There's no normal here. We need to use this moment to create the architecture for our nation's future. And that includes making the robust investments in education so that our system and our students can compete globally. It is a very unique time in our country. We're recovering from the greatest public health and economic crisis in a generation. Communities of color continue to face systemic racism. We need bold proposals that rise to the level of the challenges so that we can look at how we are using education to improve people's lives. Our schools, our teachers, and our students, and I believe this, have been struggling for far too long. We are the richest country in the world. It is unconscionable that teachers continue to be forced to take money out of their own pockets to buy paper, to buy pencils, even food for their students. And it is unacceptable that schools and school systems that predominantly serve students of color are often considerably more underfunded than the schools that serve a white population. After a period of disinvestment, I believe that we need to see more long-term investment and not a return to austerity. We need to make sure that taxpayers get their money's worth and the rich and not the middle class carry the burden of taxes. So we worked closely with the administration. We delivered a transformational $1.9 trillion package, the American Rescue Plan, $170 billion to help our K through 12 schools, colleges, universities safely reopen to accelerate the learning for students most impacted by the pandemic. House Democrats included a maintenance of equity provisions to protect low-income school districts from disproportionate cuts by states like those we saw during the Great Recession. It also included a provision that I'm particularly proud of and that Anna mentioned, that I have championed for nearly 2 decades, the expansion of and the improvement of the child tax credit, which is a lifeline to the middle class and will cut child poverty in half, making an enormous difference in the lives of our children and, yes, their educational opportunities. We know from research that living in poverty reduces a child's readiness for school. It leads to poor physical health, motor skills, diminishes a child's ability to concentrate and remember information. It reduces attentiveness, curiosity, and motivation. We cannot expect kids to learn and to succeed if they're hungry or they are studying in the dark with a flashlight because the lights have been turned off. So the child tax credit offers that new opportunity. And with regard to cutting child poverty in half, it's about 55%. So we're also now working with the administration on a $2.3 trillion, the American Jobs Plan, $100 billion to rebuild K through 12 schools across the country, an additional $12 billion investment in the community college infrastructure, cornerstone of education and training system, especially for non-traditional and disadvantaged students. We provide $48 billion for workforce development and for worker protections through registered apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships that strengthen that pipeline for more women, for more people of color to access educational skills and the opportunities for those skills. Anna mentioned that it's between 65–70% of people in the United States don't have a 4-year a college degree. And it's wonderful if you can have it, but it's not the end of the world if you can't. And that's where we have to step in to provide the opportunities for folks who can't or do not want to go on to a four-year a college degree, to make sure that their dreams and their aspirations are realized. We are working with the president on the American Families Plan. Groundbreaking proposes universal pre-K, free community college, major increase to the Pell Grant program to make college more affordable for disadvantaged students. Really serious and crucial investments in our nation's teachers and their training and development. And my view, providing universal pre-K would improve the lives of children and of working families. And studies demonstrate that children attending universal pre-K programs do better academically in later grades. And so investing in pre-K plays a critical role in ensuring that our kids are equipped with the tools that they need to be able to succeed early on. Let me just mention the president's fiscal year budget of 2022. We have a willing partner when it comes to robust investments in education with this administration. The request is $102.8 billion for education programs. And that comes under the Labor HHS subcommittee. It's a 40% increase over current levels. Unprecedented will go a long way to reverse years of underinvestment. It's not enough money to throw money at a problem. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be looking at what that architecture is for the future. And we need to look at the resources in terms of the relief packages that the administration has proposed, but also the appropriations process going forward. And I would just tell you that as chair of this committee, it's good to be the chair, by the way. It's good to have the gavel. It's wonderful. It's my job to ensure the most dollars go to those who need them most, particularly those schools and students who come from underserved communities. So in finishing up, it's a new dawn. It really is. We need to continue to enhance these targeted efforts, because investing in schools and teachers and students is investing in our future. We can choose to create public policy that in fact will level the playing field and reinvent that American dream so that anyone, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, get a shot at that American dream. And that's what education has been about for all of our lives. As a daughter of an immigrant family could only dare dream their daughter would serve in the House of Representatives, they saw that their sacrifices for my ability to get the best of an education was the best way for me to succeed. Others ought to have that opportunity as well. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with all of you tonight.
Thank you, Rosa. And especially it so pleases me to say Madam Chairwoman.
We used to sit in meetings, in leadership meetings, and you know what, we're not saying who said what, but we just had eye contact, or maybe we just rolled our eyes. Anyway, it's wonderful to be with you.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit it to one because I want to turn it over to Dan Leeds and Randy Weingarten to join in the conversation and respond. Is there any area of bipartisanship that can be achieved on education? You know, the Appropriations Committee was always a fairly bipartisan platform. What's your assessment of the prospects for some sense of bipartisanship on the issue of education?
Yeah. Well, you know, look, my experience, and I think some of Anna's analysis is that I think that voters care deeply about education. Look, I chair the Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee. Tom Cole is my counterpart, Tom Cole from Oklahoma. And I can tell you that Tom Cole and I have worked together to produce legislation when he was chair and I was ranking. Now I'm chair and he was ranking. And for the first time in several years, we passed a Labor appropriations bill. He believes, as I do, in Title I, in special education, in Pell Grants, in TRIO, in Gear Up. HBCUs, tribal colleges. So there is a real working relationship. And I believe that there are others that have, that view. And we have passed legislation that when we received the president's budget, especially when Tom was the chair, where they, zeroed out or eliminated TRIO and Gear Up and workforce students studying in college. He just said in opening remarks at our committee hearings, we're not going there. We're just not going there. I believe there is the opportunity. I think education is an area where we come, where we can come together on a number of issues. And in my experience on our subcommittee, that has in fact really been the case. There are a whole lot of other areas in which we can't get to square one, but I think we have some opportunity with regard to education policy.
Great. Two people will join the conversation and respond to Chairwoman's comments and ask some questions. Let me begin with Dan Leeds. As I mentioned before, co-founder of Education Champions. Education Champions has the goal of elevating the importance of education in public discourse and creating a political environment where supporting excellent public education from cradle through career is a priority for federal, state, and local lawmakers. He's also the founder and president of the National Public Education Support Fund, and again, another proud Cornell alum. Dan, take it away.
Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Congressman delauro. Thanks, Anna. It's great to have you all here, and it's wonderful that Cornell supports the Cornell Institute of Politics. So focusing on the addition of community college and sort of making it a right? How does one look at that from a political perspective or an electoral perspective? And how do we think about building the public support to actually move the legislation through?
There's a lot of support for community college, including 2 years of free community college. But I think that we've probably messaged around it too narrowly. Going back to that point I made about the fact that the vast majority of people in this country will not go get a 4-year degree. We know that if you don't have a 4-year degree, and there's a lot of 2-year degrees that are not real degrees that aren't worth it. We don't have to go there. So you end up, with folks who just don't have the skills, right, to get good paying jobs that don't necessarily require college education, but we're not leaving K through 12, not leaving high school ready to take, jobs in tech and manufacturing and those kinds of places that have stable jobs that, stay in this country. And so I think that linking community college with the private sector, educational institutions around apprenticeships and skills training, and giving people a path to be able to get the skills they need to get. I mean, there are lots of companies that can't fill the jobs that they have because people aren't graduating from high school with those skills. And so, I mean, as a standalone, there's a lot of support for community college and free community college, at least for 2 years. But I think it's a bit of an orphan out there if it's not kind of attached to a larger critique of our economy and the rise of a service economy that has led to, most of the job growth being in low wage work. And we need to find a way to use community college as a pathway to better paying, jobs.
If I can just see what Anna says is reality, and that we have the opportunity, and that's what we are trying to take and to broaden that the tie of community colleges with industry. And you can see it, you see it everywhere. I mean, we have something called Strengthening Community College Training Grants, where it's a partnership between a community college and an industry. I'll take Connecticut with Sikorsky aircraft, with the insurance industry in Connecticut, where our community colleges are partnering and creating jobs for insurance adjusters. We have Gateway Community College in New Haven, which is partnering with the utility companies to create utility managers' jobs, which are high-paying jobs. It's absolutely the case that we need to link community college, that experience with what I call the registered apprenticeships. We have some, other models out there which lead to that no degree and a lot of expense for folks. But I think there is a great market for addressing community college in its purest, in its fullest form of allowing the internship or the apprenticeship with an industry, and at the end of that process, there is a job waiting for someone. And I mean, it's being done, quite frankly, all over Connecticut. We have it with the defense industry, we have it with the insurance industry, and it's working very, very, very well.
Thank you very much. Did you want to?
Dan, would you be comfortable if we brought Randy Weingarten into the conversation? Then we can do.
That's what I was going to suggest. Go ahead.
Perfect. All right. Let me then formally introduce Randy, president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers, AFT champions fairness, democracy, economic opportunity, high quality public education, obviously healthcare and public service for students, their families and communities. She's launched major efforts to place real education reform high on the nation's and her union's agenda. She created the AFT Innovation Fund, a groundbreaking initiative to support sustainable, innovative, and collaborative education reform projects developed by members in their local unions. She led an AFT committee that called for all prospective teachers to meet a high entry standard as in medicine or law so that they're prepared from the day they enter the classroom. And again, one of the most prominent Cornellians that I know. As always, Randy, thank you for your leadership. Now let's just do one thing before we turn it over to you. Natalie's going to give everybody instructions on how to ask questions. As soon as she finishes those instructions, Randy, would love your comments, response, and assessment, and a give and take, a back and forth with Anna and Chairwoman delauro. Natalie, give us some instructions.
Great. So for questions tonight, normal format will follow. If you'd like to ask your question live, you can go to the bottom of your screen and use that raise hand function. If you prefer to type out your question, I'm happy to read them out just at the bottom of your screen. Again, there is a Q&A function there and you can type it through. So happy to take questions from both methods tonight.
Randy Weingarten.
Great. So I want to just thank Anna and the Congresswoman and Dan, and I can't believe we have all these Cornellians, but none of us will start singing the alma mater. Exactly. I just want to there's something that Anna and Rosa kind of, they both said and I just want to kind of reinforce and re-up it. I said it. There's lots of practices that we know actually really work to help kids. And, you see those practices in grade schools. And one of the biggest issues becomes, how do you scale and sustain what really works? What are the strategies that work? How do you create the muscle? How do you scale and sustain? And what Rosa has done, sorry, I should call her Chair delauro,
Please.
but what Rosa has done, thank you, is that both throughout her congressional career, and I saw it in the work we did in New Haven around community schools and around a contract we negotiated several years ago, but also now in the work that she does in appropriations, is that she uses funding to help get to good strategy and good practice. So the child tax credit, the kind of, Rosa just kind of laundry listed a whole bunch of funding streams from the feds. And what we actually saw in the first 25 years that the federal government funded as its role in civil rights, education, civil rights, since the Great Society, there's 50, 60 years. The first 25 years was funding Title I, really trying to make sure that poor kids got at least some remedial funds or some funds from the federal government. And you saw much bigger and bolder increases in achievement in the first 25 years of work that the federal government did. Linda Darling-Hammond has all this data. Then in the next 25 or 30 years, where the strategy had changed to accountability as opposed to funding. And so part of what I want to ask, and look, I'm giving a big speech tomorrow on all of this in terms of recover, in terms of reopen, recover, and reimagine, and use many of the things that Anna just said about tutoring, about emotional and social safety, and using all those. But you need the funding spent wisely in a collaborative way in school districts. In some ways, Steve, I was just in Carl Place, one of the school districts that you used to represent, and you could see it. And so the real question I have for both Anna and Rosa, and for Dan too, because this vexes us all the time, is how do you take what you know works and what you've seen work, and how do we try to scale it and sustain it so that it builds confidence throughout the nation? That's the real question that would turn around confidence in public education.
That's a really hard question.
It's only one, Anna, that I've been dealing with for 20 years and still don't know the answer.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I do think that there are a few characteristics in successful policymaking. One of them is universality. I mean, there's a reason why Social Security and Medicare will always be popular, because everybody, it's considered social insurance, and people pay in and they get out, and it's not considered. And I think we have to figure out a way to have education fit into that frame. It's hard because it's, especially K through 12, is mostly funded at the state and local level and not the federal level. And indeed, there is I think an ideological objection to national or federal standards, notwithstanding No Child Left Behind by a Republican. There's a real resistance to that. And so I don't have a good answer, but I think finding a way for that characteristic, because as I mentioned at the beginning, because people are always at different points in their life cycle and their kids' life cycle, there are various times in your life where you care about it deeply. And then once you're done, you don't really care anymore because your kids are out of school. So finding a way to understand the universal benefits of high quality public education. Some of that I think comes from some of the return on investment research by Heckman and others on early childhood. Like there are economic arguments you can make for a strong public education system and access to higher ed. Like we know there are those kinds of arguments. They tend to be not very emotional or relatable, so they tend to not work as well. But finding a way to kind of combine the universal benefit, of investment in what we know works, not just of K-12, but preparing people for jobs of the future, especially if they don't go to college, feels like a really, really important piece of it, but also really hard, like I said, because education is kind of state by state, locality by locality.
I would probably add to that and say there are really probably three key things to do. The Biden administration's and Chairwoman DeLauro's efforts to cut childhood poverty in half is a huge part. In other words, building a supportive platform for all kids. That would be number one. I think when you look around the world, you see that countries that have higher performing systems, first of all, they have a stable and supportive environment for young kids. Secondly, they have mechanisms for training people broadly and joining peers together and giving people more time to learn from each other. If you go to China, one of their methods is to to sort of pair schools together, that where they give the money to successful schools to turn around less successful schools. They give time for a lot of collaboration. And number three is, I think you see how they provide the pathways from high school into jobs and learning, as we talked about with community colleges and skills training.
Let me just add on the notion of the universality, and Anna spoke about Social Security. And you know, when I thought a lot about the child tax credit, and I actually spoke to it, and I'm not, please don't misunderstand, I'm not being self-serving or name dropping. When I spoke to the president about the child tax credit, when I had that wonderful opportunity, he was sitting under a portrait of Franklin Roosevelt. And I said, you know, Franklin Roosevelt lifted 90% of seniors out of poverty with Social Security, that we had the opportunity, and the way that the child tax credit is constructed is that it will, it helps poor families, it helps working families, it helps middle-class families. So no one gets a sense, 90% of our children will be getting the same monthly payment, so that it's not my child is getting something at the risk of your child not getting it. And so that the universality of it is critically important. Secondly, I would just say that, you know, Randy, in your question, you have to be committed to public education and the value of the public education. We have been through several years now where there just was not any, the view was to privatize our education system, or to bifurcate it in some way, and that we should not be investing the funding that we need to deal with public education. And with regard to the funding, there has to be some consistency. You in order for, to begin to have the principles root, or the programs that are successful. I mean, I will give you the one when we had a training program that was, I think $800 million that went for the partnership between community schools and industry. Well, new administration, it was turned around. We are, and it was eliminated. So now we are beginning to try to build back. But you have to look at where the successful models are, and you have to then really provide a consistent stream of resources. I think it's true with the differences, because education is so state funded, that you have the disparities that will exist, but we need to be able to overcome that. And we've got several programs like Title I, like the IDEA and some of the others that help to level that playing field. And we have a responsibility to provide the substantial resources. And there's a $20 billion increase to Title I grants. I mean, that is unheard of, and that's, it's huge.
It's huge. I mean, I want to just put a pin in what Rosa just said. The doubling of Title I will create, even more than the rescue plan, even though the rescue plan is huge, the doubling of Title I will create predictability. I'll give you one example in a very concrete way. Right now, we want a whole bunch of, and need, because of all of the social isolation and the prolonged effects of all of this physical isolation on our kids. We really need to wrap nursing, guidance, social workers, psychologists, services around schools. A lot of us talk about it as community schools. There's a huge shortage of guidance counselors. There's a huge shortage of school nurses. And people are starting to say, well, should we even use the rescue plan to hire people? Well, It's hard to hire people if there's a huge shortage. But with the predictability of Title I funds, and people see that that funding will continue, we can start working with colleges, with HBCUs, with others to create a pipeline for guidance counselors and for school psychologists, because they'll know that that funding is still going to be there the next year and the year after. And so it creates a virtuous circle when you have predictable funding that can go for these things that you know are really important in terms of dealing with emotional and social issues. And one of the things we've learned in the last few years is that the route into academics is a welcoming and safe environment. When kids feel welcome and safe, it opens people up. When kids are fed, it just opens kids up to the learning process. And so that's why these things become really important. But if you don't have the guidance counselors, you don't have the psychologists, you don't have the nurses, and you can't find them, and districts don't know whether or not they're going to have the money the next year, the year after, then they're not going to hire them. And people are not going to come out of school. People are not going to train for these jobs.
Well, but just to say, because again, you have to make the leap from the rescue program, where there is $1 billion for counselors and for nurses, mental health professionals in our schools. And you have to translate that. Steve, you said on the appropriations committee, you have to translate that to the appropriations committee, where it's not something that's going to last for a few short months, like direct payments. Direct payments will go away, but a child tax credit is baked in, and it will be there and helping to lift families out of poverty. And if you start to take a look at social and emotional learning and build that foundation, and community schools, we had community schools. Anna may remember that we had the Conti Community School in New Haven. It was from 6 a.m. to 8 or 9 o'clock. Everybody was, parents, kids, grandparents, etc. And we ended it. Well, we're going to go back to that, and we're putting money into that effort. But that has got to be sustained. And we're going to try to root things as quickly as we can, but it has got to be sustained over the years.
Natalie, I know that we have to go to a special guest in just a few minutes. I see we have two hands up, one from Harriet Schleifer, the other from former Congressman Martin Frost. Let's see if we can get those two questions in with the consent of our guests, and then Dan Leeds will introduce our very special guest.
Great. So Harriet Schleifer, looks like you're unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman delauro. You were at the groundbreaking of Chapel Haven Schleifer Center a few years ago, and we were very honored to have you there. And I must say that when it comes to being a champion for people of all abilities, I would like to thank you for that. My question is, because so much of public school funding is done at the literally very, very local level with property taxes, etc. How do we convert our thinking to totally change the formula for public school funding so that it's not a neighborhood by neighborhood situation, and it's not an older population who want to vote down the school budgets so that their taxes don't have to be increased? Is there not a way to take people's income and devote X percentage at the state level of everyone's income to put towards, which could be something very, progressive, and therefore add to what we were just discussing as predictable funding, so that people aren't, groups of people and cohorts with different needs and ideas don't butt heads, but actually contribute to the benefit of all.
I think it's a hard concept to deal with when you're to get that across at the state level, to if you will, just because I think education has become such a focus of locally. It really is. And I'm going to ask Randy, who's looked at these issues and get her thoughts on this. I just think politically I think it's a tough sell to move in that direction. I just think trying to get that across is really very difficult politics. And Randy and Anna may have a comment, Dan, on that as well. I don't know that flies politically.
Anna?
It is, look, we've been talking about changing the property tax system of funding public education for as at least 50 years. And what happens is that, there's been all these lawsuits about challenging things, but what has worked more effectively is to have the state deal with adequacy and equity, and then to have the federal government deal with through a civil rights process of further appropriations. And I think, as much as I agree with you that it's discriminatory and it doesn't work in any number of ways, part and parcel of how effective policy works in the United States is not only universality, as Anna said so eloquently, but we have to make sure that government can work. And when you have too many ideas that never get advanced or never get done, then people start believing that government can't work. And there is enough ways through the kind of funding sources that Rosa was talking about that we could actually make government work effectively for kids. I think the work, the Biden rescue plan, family plan, and jobs plan, these are fundamental shifts that will create an ability for families to access the American dream, and plus they are doable right now if Congress will pass them. And I think that becomes something that's important, because we have to create confidence and trust that government can actually work to solve people's problems. So
Steve,
that's what we're trying to do.
Steve, my wife is a retired elementary school teacher.
Martin, hold on 1 second. Let me introduce you. This is former Congressman Martin Frost from Texas. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, my wife is a retired elementary school principal. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Jo Ellen. I'm Martin's wife. I spent 16 years as an elementary school principal in a high-powered school district in Kansas. I've also been a Title I reading teacher, and I've taught on the university level. My concern is for these youngsters who we have a new problem. We've also always dealt with low-performing students, for low-motivated students, for students from families that education was not a priority. But now we have even more, because we have dealt with remote learning. I fortunately have not had to experience it, but I have children and grandchildren who have, and they're from motivated homes. What are we going to do about these little people who school was tough for in the first place? They were not succeeding. They were getting some help. They were behind their classmates, and now they're really behind. The emotional piece for those children is devastating. What can be done? This is a new dynamic problem.
Let's take some quick perspective on that. Then we're going to turn it over to Dan Leeds to introduce our international guest. Anyone on this?
Well, it's kind of the subject of my speech tomorrow, but first off, you have to reopen schools fully, 5 days a week. And just spoiler alert, I'm unequivocally going to say that tomorrow. Conditions have changed and we can do that. And we just passed a resolution at the AFT today. We had our executive council meeting which unanimously supports fully reopening schools 5 days a week because all those conditions have changed. That's number one. Number two, what we have learned, and thank you for your service, but what we have learned is that it is really about how you spark passion and how you build confidence and mojo, relationships, and resilience. So it's a combination in terms of recovery of not thinking about it as academic loss, but as educational disruption. And that we need to kind of wrap emotional social services around and then do a combination of what classroom teachers and great principals have done best, which is really kind of assess where kids are. And then you create a year-long program of academic recovery. So you do have intervention teams, you lower class size, you do ongoing tutoring that's aligned with classwork, but you make it joyful as opposed to punishment-based. And then we have all sorts of ideas about how to do that in terms of science and civics and project-based instruction and things like that.
Anna, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I just I just agree with all of it. And in the parent work I've done, what's interesting is, like I said at the beginning, there's a huge amount of support for that kind of intervention, and also real recognition that certain kids have had different challenges than other kids. And across, what I was sort of pleasantly surprised was that it was true across partisan lines. So you had, whether you maybe had 80% of Democrats agreeing when you do that, you'd have 60% of Republicans. So it was a kind of cross partisan support for that, kind of intervention. The other two things that I have found interesting about the work with parents is that for kids who've mostly been in person, they still did not have an ideal year. So this isn't just about the kids who were at home, whether it was the school was trying to teach online and in person, and so it wasn't ideal for the in-person, or all of the social and emotional development stuff was also not there, like sports being canceled. And so it's not just an issue of the kids who've been at home. We have to think about all of the kids. And because of that, there's a lot, thinking about, about universality, there seems to be real consensus among parents of kids K through 12 that all the kids are going to need help. It's going to need to be extra. And, I think it's like, that's why I said at the beginning, where we almost have this strange opportunity right now to rethink and invest more than we would have. Not that I'm suggesting it was good to have COVID, but there's a momentum to that investment that we didn't see, I think, before COVID.
We're about,
if you found a partisan difference between, I think what you're saying is that there isn't a partisan difference and people want to see their kids back in school again. And they are concerned about their social and emotional learning and what the psychological effects of COVID had been. I would just say to Joelle that, and again, yes, thank you for your service, but when you think about some of these children who come from underserved areas, who come from high poverty areas, that we're looking also, and Randy is so on this, is about the kinds of teachers that are teaching these youngsters, and there's usually the least qualified, honestly, teachers who are teaching in some of these schools in these underserved areas, and they're more underfunded. These schools are more underfunded than the schools that serve white populations. And that's something that has to be addressed. That's something that has been, that we have just seen with this pandemic, and that this gives us an opportunity to try to address that in some way. You give kids great teachers and good environment, etc. They'll succeed. Kids will succeed, from their circumstances. Anyway, I think parents are all wanting kids to be back in school and looking for ways in which they can catch up. And Randy has been at the forefront of thinking about how we allow kids to catch up, over the next, absolutely. God, it's been unbelievable how she's been a champion of this, of lost learning.
Anna, do you have anything published on your data? Anything resources we can make available to our folks, or is it all proprietary? Not public, okay.
No.
All right. Well, Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro, thank you so much for your leadership. We know that you have other commitments tonight. Anna, we understand you also have other commitments. So let us thank you for everything that you have done. Very enlightening session. And Rosa, I will meet you in New Haven, where I will swallow my pride literally.
You're on. You're on.
And with that, let me turn it. Randy's going to stay with us. We have a very brief global perspective on education, which Dan Leeds is going to set up for us. Dan.
Great. Well, what we have next is a real treat, which is Andreas Schleicher, who's been called by Atlantic Magazine's the world's schoolmaster, the most influential education expert you've never heard of, but who speaks on behalf of children everywhere, at least on behalf of their data. I would say in answer to the person who mentioned that about local property taxes, in a report prepared by the OECD, it mentioned getting rid of local property taxes as the #1 way to help American education, which is amongst the least equitable in the world. Only about 30% of American students are really well served by our system. I'll only further say about Andreas. He's the world leading expert on education from a global perspective. And when Andreas comes to a meeting in the US, you never know whether his last stop was providing advice at 10 Downing Street or the education ministries in Moscow, Beijing, or Buenos Aires, or if he's just coming from his office in Paris, where he's the director of education and skills. You do know, however, that Andreas will have an amazing presentation, have the latest global data, be very thought-provoking, and take on the status quo. Due to the time difference tonight, it's 2:00 in the morning in Paris, Andreas joins us by video as he talks about the lack of US education achievement in the context of an education reality that will be more impacted by climate change and artificial intelligence than COVID-19. The challenge of reconciling new goals and fostering innovation while recognizing how slow the education sector is to change, and a lack of US investment on cutting edge education technology, and the difficult politics for education change when investments are upfront and improvements and their tremendous payback come later. And with that, I'll give you Andreas Schleicher.
These are difficult times for education. Last year, 1.5 billion students were locked out from their schools. If you have children, you saw how remote learning became the lifeline for education, but access, use, and quality of digital resources have hugely amplified inequality. You can say that children are the least vulnerable to the coronavirus, but there's no group that has been more deeply affected by the public policy responses to contain this virus. Now, in the middle of this pandemic, where we can't even predict what's going to happen tomorrow, you asked me to look 2 years ahead. And all I will say is that the future will always surprise us. Climate change will have a far greater impact on our lives than the pandemic. Artificial intelligence will be far more disruptive and pushes us to think so much harder about the goals of education. And then there are lots of other trends shaping the future of education. In education, we should be more open to multiple futures, imagine them, and then think what they mean for policy and practice. One scenario is that the status quo will just continue. Education monopolies will remain, teachers will teach, students learn, And surely the status quo has always many protectors. But the laws, regulations, structures, and institutions on which we tend to focus when reforming educations are just like this small visible tip of a huge iceberg. The reason why it's so hard to move education systems is that there's a much larger invisible part under the waterline. And that invisible part is about the interests, the beliefs, the motivations, the fears of people who are involved, teachers and parents included. The frogs rarely clear the swamp, and the loss of privilege is pervasive in education. And then there is this asymmetry between the costs and benefits of change. Now, the costs of education reform are certain, they are immediate, but the benefits are uncertain, long-term. As a policymaker, you can lose an election over education when something small goes wrong. You never win an election over education simply because it takes so much time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. We also lack an education industry that pushes innovation and absorbs risks. And educational research is often disengaged from the real needs of real classrooms. That's why changing education can be as hard as, moving graveyards. You just can't rely on the people out there to help you. Think back to the world in the year 2000 when we started with PISA, the global metric to track school learning outcomes across the world. In those days, students read carefully curated textbooks, and when they had a question, they could look the answer up in an encyclopedia and trust that answer to be true. Today, they will look for their answers on Google, and nobody will tell them what is right and what is wrong. Now, literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing, validating knowledge. It was in the early 2000s that technology began to change what we read and how we read. But the capacity of American 15-year-olds to understand, use, evaluate, reflect on written information didn't change in those years. You can see that here in the red line. In 2006, when we did our third PISA assessment, that was the year before the iPhone was invented. Twitter was still a sound, the Amazon still a river. Around 2009, social media began to have a real impact on the nature of reading. In fact, we began to talk to our computers in those years. But again, educational outcomes kept flatlining. And then think how robotics, virtual reality, cloud computing, big data, artificial intelligence began to mesh the real world and the digital world, but learning outcomes in the US, and in fact, in most parts of the industrialized world, did not keep up with those changes. If you'd see a flat line like this on a brain scan, you'd get very worried. The speed, volume, reach of information flows in this digital ecosystem has created the perfect storm for fake news to thrive, affecting public opinion and political choices. Contrast that with just 14% of 15-year-old Americans being able to distinguish between fact and opinion when the tasks are complex. You can say this figure is 4 percentage points up from where the US stood 20 years ago, but again, we live in a totally different world right now. But then, some education systems have figured this out. Look at Beijing, Jiangsu, Shanghai, Zhejiang in China. That moved up to the top of the scale. Or see how Singapore keeps advancing from good to great, or how Estonia steadily moves to the top among OECD countries, despite the fact that its expenditure per student remains about 30% lower than the OECD average. Portugal advanced to the OECD average, despite being so severely hit by the financial crisis. Or look at Poland. And some countries that perform still well below the OECD average saw remarkable improvements in their student performance. Look at Peru or Albania. Brazil or Turkey may look a little bit less impressive, but between 2003 and 2018, Turkey was able to double the coverage of the 15-year-olds who are covered by PISA. For many years, Sweden used to be the most rapidly deteriorating school system. But then around 2010, they took courageous steps to fix it. And you can see how they caught the ball and got things back on track. That shows how policy can make a real difference now. So that's how we get to the league tables of education systems that you're familiar with. They always have a history now. You can see a similar picture when you take a step back and look at the skills in the adult workforce. Here you can see the proportion of 55 to 65-year-olds who are good at solving problems using digital technology. You can see the US comparatively well positioned, second only to New Zealand. And of course, that gives the US a huge advantage in the digital economy. But when you look at the young population entering the labor market, things look different. As you'd expect, in every country, young people are better prepared for the digital world than older ones. The bars are longer. No? But while the US was at the frontier among older workers, it's just an average performer among the young. No? And you can see that's because countries like Singapore or Finland, which started out very modestly, are now at the frontier. Of course, there's huge differences across countries in the time students spend learning, both in school, you can see that here marked in blue, and out of school, things like tutoring, homework, and so on, you can see that marked in yellow. Look at the United Arab Emirates, where 15-year-olds spend close to 60 hours learning per week. And then you contrast that with Finland, where it's just a little bit more than half of that time. But when you look at productivity, you can see that in Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Estonia, students learn a lot in very little time, while students in the UAE learn little in a lot of time. And in the US too, the issue is not so much about the volume of learning opportunities or even aggregate spending. It's all about productivity, learning gains per hour. Let me bring you back to the PISA league table once more. Now, let's look at the US a little bit more closely. In fact, it's 10% most disadvantaged students come out towards the bottom of the scale, while the 10% students from the wealthiest backgrounds deliver world-class results. You might conclude from this that poverty is destiny. But then take similarly disadvantaged students in Portugal. You can see they do much better than their American counterparts. And you can take students with exactly the same background characteristics in the 4 provinces in China, and the 10% most disadvantaged students in those Chinese provinces do better than the average American. That's because they attract the strongest principals to the toughest schools and the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. They always align resources with needs. It's a powerful illustration that poverty need not be destiny. Of course, we shouldn't blame all of that on schools alone. Inequality starts much earlier in the lives of students, and you can see that many countries make massive investments in the early years. Look at Poland. In 2005, it was 25 percentage points behind the US when it comes to enrollment of 3 to 5-year-olds. Now it is 20 percentage points ahead of the United States. Now, let's look at it a second scenario. Most things that are not built for the network age eventually crack apart under its pressures. Parents one day might vote with their feet. Learning may take place through a much more diverse and flexible arrangements now, with technology becoming the key driver. And we've probably seen already more technological and social innovation in education over the last 10 months during the pandemic than over the last 10 years. The most visible benefit has been far greater personalization. While you study mathematics on a computer, the computer can now study how you study and then make your learning experience so much more granular, so much more adaptive, so much more interactive. We're also seeing really big leaps in assessment and exams. Whether you talk about assessments through simulations, hands-on assessments in vocational settings, or machine learning algorithms scoring essays. The time of multiple choice bubble sheets is sort of over, and learning and assessment are becoming fully integrated. Learning analytics hold perhaps the greatest promise here. Now, teachers can now get a real sense of how different students learn differently, where students get interested and where they get bored, where they advance and where they get stuck. And so teachers get a much better sense of how they can structure learning time and which students need what extra. The US was down to 20%. Third scenario, perhaps we will see the opposite. And, like in Northern Europe, schools become community hubs, opening their school walls, connecting with their communities, favoring ever-changing forms of learning, civic engagement, social innovation. And those school systems did actually particularly well during the pandemic because that always made education a whole of society project. They try less to push new and sometimes old ideas into schools, but they do very well in finding the good ideas in classrooms and then scaling and spreading them. But then, such a scenario relies on a lot of frontline capacity. Now, many people consider the US a school system with a lot of local control, but it depends from what perspective you look at that. If you look at this through the lens of a school leader, your relative discretion is actually quite limited as a school in the US. Look at the Netherlands on the left side, where schools make over 90% of all decisions. Now, it is public schools who decide how they hire for what, how they allocate their resources, how they tailor their curriculum, what pedagogical vision do they pursue. In the US, just 16% of decisions are taken at the front line. Now, most of the decisions in the US are taken actually quite removed from that front line. Or, a fourth scenario, maybe one day traditional goals and functions of schooling will be entirely overwritten by technology. And education is going to take place everywhere, anytime, and it's going to reach everyone with innovation scaling rapidly. Of course, we can construct an endless range of such scenarios. The point is that such thinking gives us the tools to imagine different futures and explore their implications for the goals and functions of education, for the organization as structures, the education workforce, and for public policy. And ultimately, to think harder about the future we want for education. In the end, the future will always ask us to manage tensions and dilemmas. How do we find the right balance between modernizing and disruption? How do we reconcile new goals with old structures? How do we support globally minded and locally rooted teachers and students? How do we foster innovation while recognizing the socially highly conservative nature of the education enterprise? How do we leverage potential with existing capacity? And how do we reconfigure the spaces, the people, the time, the technology to educate people for their future rather than our past? Thank you very much.
Well, quite a bit there. We have about, 3 minutes left. So why don't we ask Randy and Dan to make some concluding comments, and then we will move on. Randy, how about you?
So, Andreas and I lead what we call the Education International OECD Committee. So I've spent a great amount of time with Andreas over the last 10 years, and EI and OECD just put together 10 ideas about what we need to do in this recovery. And they're very similar to some of the things that he said and some of the things that I will say tomorrow in the speech that I'm giving. But the bottom line is this. Anna is right. There is a potential here to actually really reimagine and have a renaissance in public education. What is clear, regardless of which side of the schooling argument one is on, the place we call school is really important to communities. In-person learning, communities having school as a hub for all sorts of other things. And I think that that has changed in a way that solidifies, even in this very fractured environment, we can build on that to do all sorts of things to prepare our kids for life, college, career, civic participation. And my North Star going forward will be, how do we help every single public school be a place parents want to send their kids, educators and school staff want to work, and kids thrive.
We will be looking forward to hearing about your speech tomorrow, Randy Weingarten. Thank you so much for your leadership and for participating tonight. Final word goes to Dan Leeds.
Got it. Well, thanks again, Steve, for organizing this. Thanks, by the way, to Randy and Congresswoman delauro and the Biden administration, who are really putting massive amounts of money to work and making sure the system stays stable. When it comes to creating forward-looking and powerful education policies, we all know that elections matter. Who we elect matters, and polling shows that almost 70% of Americans think that a candidate's position on education issues should be a top priority for making voting decisions. But if we want that to be a reality, we have to organize, and we have to organize voters to continue the types of policies and funding that will really advance education going forward. So I'll leave you with that. If you want great education, you have to organize for it.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, Randy. May 19th, 7 p.m., navigating international hostage situations, something you don't hear a lot about. You will on May 19th. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. We hope that you'll participate in future Cornell events. Google Cornell Institute of Politics, and you can be apprised of our future events. Thanks, everybody, and take care. Bye.